When we talk about valuation, we're talking about the very heart of finance. And it's so often mistaken for a pure science, something you just solve with a spreadsheet. But it's not. It's a craft. It's where a really compelling story has to stand up to the cold, hard scrutiny of numbers.
And that brings us to this central puzzle, the one we're going to unravel today. How is it that two brilliant analysts looking at the exact same company, with the exact same data, can come up with valuations that are just worlds apart? Well, the answer isn't in their calculators. It's in the stories they're telling.
So here's our roadmap. We'll start with that paradox. Then we'll get into the foundational link between a company's story and its numbers. We'll look at the framework for building a strong narrative, how an expert's judgment fits in, and then see it all play out with some real-world examples. And finally, we'll talk about why valuation is a living, breathing process.
Okay, let's dive right in. To solve that opening puzzle, you have to look beyond the spreadsheet. The whole idea that valuation is some kind of purely objective calculation, well, that's where all the confusion really begins.
Here's the most crucial thing to understand. Valuation is a craft, and it's one you hone through experience. It's not a science with one right answer, but it's not some unteachable art form either. It's like any craft. It blends technique with judgment. The ability to connect a company's story to its real value, that's a skill you refine over years after seeing countless companies and market cycles.
And that brings us to the foundational idea, the thing that really solves our paradox. Let's take a look at how value is really put together. At its core, a good valuation is a synthesis. It's where the story of a business, its vision, its competitive edge, its market, gets fused with the discipline of a financial model. Think about it. A great story without numbers is just a fantasy. But numbers without a story, they're meaningless. Just an intimidating wall of data with zero context or conviction.
And we have to make a really critical distinction here between valuing and pricing. Valuing, which is our focus, is that disciplined search for a company's intrinsic worth, based on the cash it can generate in the future. Pricing, on the other hand, is just what the market is willing to pay for it right now, and that's often driven by emotion, momentum, and psychology. Our goal is to master the first, so we can be smart about the second.
All right, so if a valuation is built on a story, what's to stop it from becoming complete fiction? Well, you need a framework. You need a disciplined way to actually structure that narrative.
This 5-step process is how you turn an abstract vision into something you can actually quantify. First, you develop the core story. Then, and this is absolutely critical, you test that story against reality. After that, you convert the story's key pieces into financial drivers, you plug those into your valuation model, and finally, you keep a feedback loop wide open. Because no story ever stays the same.
And this is maybe the most important reality check of all, the 3P test. First, is this story even possible? Does it break any laws of physics or logic? Second, is it plausible? This is where so many stories fall apart. They fall into what's called the big market delusion. The idea that just because a market is huge, success is guaranteed. It totally ignores the brutal reality of competition. And finally, is it probable? What's the real likelihood they can pull it off? This test is what separates a disciplined narrative from a total pipe dream.
And now we get to the most subtle part of the craft. This is the expert's judgment. It's the moment where that qualitative story gets translated into the hard, cold numbers of a financial model.
This is where it all comes together. A story about a powerful brand isn't just a nice little anecdote. It directly translates into your assumption for the target operating margin. A story about global expansion? That becomes your revenue growth rate. And your gut feeling on business risk or the quality of the management team? That directly shapes the discount rate, the WACC, which is probably the most sensitive lever in the entire valuation.
Let that sink in for a second. The narrative isn't just some nice-to-have window dressing. It provides the logical foundation for your single most critical assumption, your assessment of risk, which comes from the story, directly shapes that discount rate, and a tiny tweak there can change the final valuation by millions, sometimes even billions of dollars.
Okay, enough theory. Let's see how this all plays out in the real world. Because nothing shows the power of narrative better than looking at a couple of famous companies whose fates were tied directly to the stories they told. So on one side, you've got Uber, a company whose story successfully evolved and unlocked massive value. And on the other, you have WeWork, a company with a fundamentally flawed narrative that just collapsed in spectacular fashion when it finally hit reality. Look at how Uber's story was never static.
Back in 2014, the story was simple. It's a car service going after the taxi market. But then, the narrative evolved into a global logistics platform. And then, it became a multifaceted delivery network. You see, with each expansion of the story, the company's potential market grew exponentially, and that, in turn, drove its valuation sky high.
And then you have WeWork. Oh boy, the story was that it was a revolutionary tech company. But the numbers? The numbers told a very different story. They showed a capital-guzzling real estate business. The narrative completely failed the plausibility test. And once that disconnect between the grand vision and the ugly reality became obvious, investor confidence just evaporated, wiping out 98% of its peak value.
So all of this brings us to a final, crucial point to take away. The work is never really done. Evaluation is never ever a final answer set in stone. You see, evaluation isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a living process. It's a continuous journey. The story has to be constantly tested against new information, a new competitor, a shift in the market. That feedback loop has to stay open, allowing reality to reshape the story, which in turn reshapes the numbers.
So I'll leave you with this question. The next time you see a stock price or hear a valuation, I want you to challenge yourself to look deeper. Don't just ask, what's the number? Ask, what's the story that gets us to that number? Because understanding that story, well, that is the true art of valuation.